We are in the middle of a long study, and this is the 11th week. So you've been here for one or two others, all right? You remember kind of what we talked about back then? No? And you guys haven't been here at all. So my big, a little bit of concern is that you can catch on to what we're kind of talking about. If you got questions, I don't mind answering them, all right? And if you want to catch up on all of them, the first 10, that all of these, they're up online on the church's website. So you can go and watch some of the previous ones if it interests you today, what you see to kind of get some of the backstory of what we've been talking about. All right? If you don't know how to get on there, ask me, ask Caleb, Grace, any of us can show you or tell you how to get on. It's on a YouTube channel for the Old Church of Christ. All right. Okie dokie. All right, Nathan, you can start after this. So far, and this would be mostly the two of you, do you think any of the arguments that we've done so far in the first 10 sessions here were more convincing or stand out to you more than others? Just curious. Give me an example.
The moths.
Moths one, okay.
I agree with her.
All right, good. To me, as important as I think that is, and I think they all are, for me,
Or the camera watched the entire, how we went into the watch implies the watchmaker, the camera implies the camera maker, the human eye.
yes, all right? That's one of my two favorites. The other one has to do with, and I think the most powerful one for me, is that we either start out the universe with no mind, or we start out with a mind. And the implications of what it means to start out with no mind, with a rock, with ether, no feeling, no thinking, no logic, nothing, is kind of a fairy tale to think that we got to the point where we have the intellect that we have in our brains and all of the other things that we talked about that are interacting with each other. I just find that extremely hard to believe. So this one to me is the most powerful argument. And then my second one that's I think easiest to remember is the one you just said, okay? That a watch implies a watchmaker, a camera implies a camera maker, which why wouldn't an eye take a maker rather than accident? All three of you, good, very good. We're going to shift again a little bit today, and we're going to talk about something else. Before I do, I want to share with you another guy's failure. Now, you guys are a little younger. Do you remember Ronald Reagan, who he is? Okay, who is he? Two things important about Ronald Reagan. Give me one.
Besides being one of our presidents.
He was a president. Well, what was he before he was a president?
Actor.
He was an actor. In fact, he was not just an actor, he was actually president of the Actors Guild later on in his life. And he was he a governor?
Yes.
He was governor of California. Okay, so he had quite a career. This is Ronald Reagan telling his. I just found this by accident, thought I'd share it with you. Let me turn this up because it's usually turned way down. It goes by a little fast.
I've long been unable to understand the atheist in this world of so much beauty, and I have an unholy desire to invite some atheists to a dinner and then serve the most fabulous gourmet dinner that has ever been concocted. And after dinner, ask them if they believe there was a cook.
I don't know. I like Ronald Reagan. He was a very good communicator, and I just thought that was, he didn't think that was funny. Caleb did. He snickered. Other arguments that we've talked about are such things as symbiotic relationships and irreducible complexity, like we see here, of things within the cell. We talked about the idea that communication, this is a real powerful one, and it's newer to me than the ones that I remember from when I was younger, but it's an extremely important one. We did like at least one lesson, maybe 1.5 lessons on the fact that it takes a mind, it takes something that is intelligent to form sentences or coding, okay? Like in a computer, we talked about computer code, we talked about writing. And the fact that a rock could accidentally somehow come up with DNA, which is very, very sophisticated, rather than a mind coming up with it first, I find that to be kind of, how can I put this? Hard to believe. I was going to say something stronger than that, but you get the idea. Today, though, we're going to start talking, and it's going to be this week, next week, possibly a third week, I don't know for sure, but we're going to start talking about something called transitional forms. Have you ever heard of the term transitional form? Okay. Transitional form is the same thing as an intermediate fossil. Okay, an intermediate fossil is a fossil that would be in between one thing and another. So if something evolved from one kind of species to another kind of species, and we find fossils of both of those, there should be fossils, if things change like Darwin says they should, there should be fossils that are in between. Okay? Evolutionists have been looking for these for years, 150 years at least. And they say they have some. And what we're going to be discussing is some of the ones that I know about and whether or not they seem viable. This week we're going to talk about in between the monkey, ape, and man. Next week we're going to talk about another kind. Next week or whenever we're going to talk about a third kind. All right? So the point is that if we see fossils of invertebrates, and we see fossils of we see fossils of fish, we see fossils of vertebrates, and we see fossils of people, all right? Get this. Why don't we see, or we should see, fossils of everything in between? Not only that, if the gradations have to be small, because if an evolutionist said, poof, one day you're a monkey, poof, the next day you're a man, it would be nothing more than a fairy tale. So they have to have gradations in between, all right? So in my mind, at least, there should be not just a lot of these and a lot of these, there should even be more, like lots more in between. Okay? Lots more. Because there's a lot of different gradations. And this happens supposedly over millions of years period of time. So that's what our discussion is going to begin with today and talk about a little bit over the next week or two. As we discuss some of these kinds of examples, I want you to keep in mind the court case that was described by Lee Strobel. I think we talked about that last week, right? Or the week before, I can't remember which. And that was that can evidence look one way and still be incorrect? Okay? So a couple of you, I think, remember that argument, right? It's at the beginning of one of his books. Can either side of this argument tell from the evidence in the presence if these animal forms evolved or if they were created? And the answer to that question is you can't. Okay? There's evidence there, but you can't tell for sure. Science wants to tell you that what they have tells you for sure, but they cannot because they didn't live back then. But neither can the creationist. So we have to look at the evidence and see, like we've done all along so far, which way you think the evidence points to. I dare to say that many evolutionists they say it must be true, okay? In other words, there's a lot of people, and I think there's a large number of people that believe in evolution, and they think that that is true first before they go and say that matter came first. If they looked at it logically, like George Wald did, that only leaves us with one possibility, and that is spontaneous generation, which is impossible. We choose to believe the impossible because we can't live with the alternative. We can't live with supernatural creation. So they start at the wrong point and then try to prove their point rather than look for where the evidence goes. And I've always tried to do it the other way around. I want to see where the evidence points and then make my decision, not make my decision and then find evidence to back it up. Okay? Big difference. So it all comes back to me again, mind first or matter first. All right? And this was, of course, the quote by Wald. Creation or spontaneous generation is what he said was the only two possibilities. And then we choose to believe the impossible because we know that life could not, it's been proven that life can't come spontaneously by chance. It's impossible, but we have to believe that if evolution is to be true. He's an honest, he still believes, well, he's passed away now. He was living during my lifetime. And of course, I said before that he won the Nobel Prize in 1960 something in science. He said those words. But we have this as opposition to, in the beginning, God. What does this God mean? It means there was a mind or an intellect first. Okay? Seems a little more reasonable to me, but we still haven't gotten to the point whether or not we think it was a God or whether we think it was some kind of intelligence. That showing that I think that the intelligence is God comes in a totally different part of this class down the road. So when we're talking about the transitions between the monkey, kind of ape, monkey, etc., chimp forms to the man forms, and that's what we're going to talk mostly about today. There are some things that they look at that I think are legitimate. Okay, these are scientific, legitimate things that they can look at today. They look at brain and skull capacity size. They look at the shape of the skull because a monkey's shape of their skull is different than a man's. They look at the jaw. The jaw of a monkey is more of a V shape, where a human is more of a U shape. Okay, the bottom jaw. They look at the teeth. The teeth are shaped differently. They look at the leg joints as to whether or not it could stand upright. Okay, if it could stand straight up, if legs were in a certain way, then yes, it must be something probably that's more human. Although, as we're going to see, there are some chimps that stand up straight perfectly nowadays. So that's not a real good argument every time. And also, the hands and the feet. Do they have opposing thumbs? Okay, do they have a kind of a hand that a human has, or kind of a hand that some animals have? So these are some things that they look at when they're looking at some of those fossils. We looked at this chart not long ago and said that, well, what this is called is the Kelvin-Zallinger chart. I can't remember the name or the time or the year or anything when it was first drawn. It's not used as much anymore, but it was used for a long time to convince people that it was that evolution was true. This is the newer form of it that came out after that one. I think this one came out afterwards. And what we're going to talk about today are where the red arrows are. Neanderthal, Nebraska, man, Java, Ramapithecus, and you can't hardly see the one out there. It's not showing up as Lucy, which is another important one. This is what they want you to believe. Okay? over time, over millions of years. See what I'm trying to show you? All right? That's the depiction that they're trying to get you somehow to believe. But that chart that we looked at just a second ago, in fact, we can go back, look at that chart again. If you read the fine print on these charts, they don't happen in that order. They put them in that order. I learned this a long time ago from a guy named John Clayton when I was listening to his lectures. And the first time I heard that, I went, man, these guys are being deceitful. This is not the correct order. In fact, this one started out, Ramapithecus started out at 2 million years ago, and it's been updated to like 12 to 14 million years ago. But these are not in the order that they think they happen, but they are in a nice order that shows it getting bigger and bigger and bigger and walking better and better and better. Right? That's a ploy that they used. It's something that they did. There's a lot of this going on where they draw things in such a way to lead the people that they want to convince that what they're telling is true. All right? So, the other thing we need to look at and remember actually is that all of this is supposed to be done by mutations. And if you remember watching the video that we talked about a little bit, it was mixed in with some other things. We mentioned mutations, and we saw the interview, a short part of it, with this scientist here. His name is Don Barton. He said a couple of important things. First of all, he said that mutations, they have to have something that will change the genes and everything else from one to another. First of all, he says that mutations don't build new things. And he used the example that you might be, the enemy might be coming to conquer you, so what do you do to stop it? You blow up your bridges. Blowing up your bridges may save you, but it doesn't build new bridges. And he says mutations are the same thing. They can take mutations, they can take and do a mutation on a cell, or they can take, there are sometimes when mutations happen on their own, that's true, but like the vast majority of them break things. They do not make new stuff. It's wishful thinking. And he said, even if they did, it would take the simplest organism has 1,000, has a Bible-sized set of information built into it. Okay, that much coded information. To get from that to a human, you have to add, he said, another 999 books of information that size. So what he's trying to point out is using mutations to get from here to here is insurmountable, because number one, they break things, they don't make new things, and you need so much more. It can't happen in the kind of number of years they say that the universe has been around. Okay? So, that's all review. Now, this is new information. First one we're going to talk about is Piltdown Man. In 1912, a laborer near a place called Piltdown, England, found a skull and a jawbone when he's digging in the gravel. And he supposed that it might be something important, so he, called the authorities down, and they claimed that it was a ape man. And they later called it Piltdown Man because of the place it was found. For 40 years, Piltdown Man was accepted as the ape man that they were trying to find without any questions at all. Until it was discovered that this ape man was a combination of an old human skull and a modern ape jawbone. Orangutan, I think. So 40 years after, so it'd be 1952, I'd have been 1 year old at that time. They knew that this was a fake. And yet, I still remember studying it in school. Listen, they hold on to what they can. Trust me, you're going to see even more of this as we move on. For decades, students were taught by their teachers and by the school textbooks that Piltdown man was proof that man evolved from an ape-like creature, but it was a total fraud in the end. This is, I'm going to show not all of them, but a few of these. I'm going to show this a short segment by this guy who explains maybe better than I do. So listen close.
The most famous hoax, and one that is much bemoaned among the evolutionary community, is the famous Piltdown Man. The supposed ape-man skull and jaw was found in 1912 by a laborer digging in a gravel pit near the town of Piltdown in England. It was announced that both pieces came from the same ancient ape-man and dubbed Piltdown Man. For 40 years, this supposed proof of human evolution was displayed in museum exhibits and textbooks as proof positive that human beings had descended from ape-like ancestors, with hand-drawn, supposed scientific images of what the creature must have looked like, all with amazing similarity to how the freak show missing links were portrayed, described, and depicted by the promotional artists as well. Only after 4 decades was the evidence re-examined and revealed as a fraud. And it wasn't even a good fraud, as one could easily see how the teeth from the jawbone had been filed down to make them look more human, and the bones had been chemically treated to make them look very old. It was simply a combination of an old human skull and a modern ape jawbone stuck together. We raise this example today not simply to rub it in that one evidence for evolution has been disproven, but to point out that the acceptance and promotion of such evidence by professionals for over 40 years can only be attributed to one of two things: pathetic scientific acumen displayed by the evolutionary scientists of the day, or an agenda that made people willing to overlook the obvious fraud to accomplish its ideological goals. For hundreds of people involved in producing museum-grade copies of the exhibit, distributing them to various museums around the world, and producing numerous textbook diagrams and descriptions based on the evidence, all not to detect the fraud, seems highly suspicious or perhaps negligent at best.
Okay? Number one. Here's number two. It's known as Nebraska Man. Nebraska Man was constructed. Okay, I want you to get this. Nebraska Man was constructed from a tooth. See this guy here? They constructed that guy, painted him up from a tooth. That's it. That's all they had. I'll say it one more time. They got that picture from that tooth. This was in 1917 when a rancher in Nebraska found a tooth on his farm. He gave it to some paleontologist friends of his that were very excited because they thought they had found an ape man. And it was very, very important for a long time. In fact, later on, when they found out that it wasn't, because it wasn't even a human tooth or a monkey tooth, it was a tooth of a pig that had been extinct. But the damage was done. I want you to think about this real quick here. Who has ever heard of the Scopes monkey trial? And I put these out of order, unfortunately, so I'm going to come back to it. Who's ever heard of this Scopes trial? Really? At Tu Brute?
I think so.
It was a long time ago,
Yeah.
1925, right?
Didn't they make a movie off of this?
We'll get to that in a second.
Okay.
Absolutely. In fact, the guy that was one of the lawyers, he's had 2 movies made out of him, about him in a sense, but most people don't know he's in one of them. All right, because it's a kid's movie, but it wasn't original. We'll talk about that in a second. This would have been 3 years before my dad was born. 1860, whatever, was it 65, 69, when Darwin's book came out? So this would have been 50, 60 years after he published his book, roughly. Darwin published his book, that this tooth came out. Well, in 1925, Tennessee had passed a law that banned evolution being taught in schools. A guy named John Scopes, which is where the Scopes trout comes from, was a Tennessee science teacher, and he was approached specifically by the ACLU so that they could have a test case to see whether or not that was constitutional. They went through the trial. It was a huge deal. It was on all the papers. The important parts to remember are he lost. He had to pay a fine of $1. But it didn't really matter if he lost. They didn't do the crime to see whether or not, they figured they were going to lose. But the exposure it got was tremendous. Because during the trial, this was the prosecution's lawyer. His name is William Jennings Bryan. And he was a Bible believer. He was a well-known lawyer. He actually ran for president. Never got president, but he ran for president one time. He was a well-known figure. They put him on the stand. And then this other guy, and his name's not coming to me right now, examined him and asked him some of these kinds of questions. Do you believe that there was a worldwide flood that wiped everybody out less than 6,000 years ago? Do you believe that God created the whole world in 6? This has nothing to do with teaching evolution. This has to do with his beliefs. And this guy was not prepared to give the right kind of answers that would make him look anything but like he was a little bit bumbling. And it destroyed not the trial, because they still won their case, but it destroyed the confidence in the United States that the Bible was right and that evolution, that the Bible was not right now, and that evolution was right instead. And that was a turning point in the United States. Not that they had scientific evidence, but they had made it look like science had the upper hand. You know one of the pieces of evidence that they used in this trial? That tooth. That tooth that was actually made from a pig. That was actually from a pig, and they made this drawing of. That tooth was used in the trial. It wasn't until after the trial they found out it was a hoax. That doesn't matter. The damage was done. Now, William Jennings Bryan is who the Cowardly Lion is based on in The Wizard of Oz. All right? There's a lot more reasons than that. If you ever want to know, there's quite a story as to what the Wizard of Oz is actually about. It's not about a yellow brick road. It's about the gold standard, and it's about the politics that was going on in that time period, the late 1800s and early 1900s. And it's a fascinating story. And every character in The Wizard of Oz has an important symbolic meaning. Okay? The yellow brick road, that's gold. The original slippers were not ruby in the book. They are silver. Stands for silver. Oz, Wizard of Oz, Oz stands for ounce. Okay? And every single character, whether it's the Tin Man or whether it's Dorothy or whether it's Toto or the Wicked Witches or the man behind the curtain, they're all symbolic of something. You'll never watch The Wizard of Oz the same way again once you know all that. So I think we talked enough about that one. I'm going to actually skip that particular one. But I think, as you can see, at this point, we're starting to get some of these to drop. The first one that we talked about just a second ago, Piltdown Man, is not even on this chart, because they knew pretty early, or they knew that by the time this chart was made, I think, that he wasn't real. But Nebraska Man is still on the chart, but we just seen it was just a pig tooth. All right? Any questions so far before we get into another one? Next one we're going to talk about is the Neanderthal. This is something I found a while back, that if Neanderthal men were bathed and shaved and dressed in modern clothes, you wouldn't be able to tell them the difference on a New York subway. And I've read that a lot of places. That's not just a maybe. Thomas Huxley was a biologist and anthropologist, and he lived up until 1895. He was known as Darwin's bulldog. He was the one that really promoted Darwin's idea once the book came out. They were friends, and he was his promoter. Huxley thought that Neanderthals were not qualitatively different from present-day Homo sapiens, in other words, people. But a big deal has been made out of this over the years, and it still is, as I'm going to show you in a minute. Yeah, they got a skeleton, but even though the fact that it looks somewhat brutish compared to modern, more modern people nowadays, one of the reasons why they did this because he stooped over. But there's a lot of people that say instead that he had a lack of vitamin D and that he probably had rickets, which is the reason why the skeleton looked like it did. In other words, it's not necessarily a monkey man, it's a man that had a degenerative disease that was bigger and more muscular than others. But here's some of the things that Neanderthals had in the site where they find Neanderthal bones that kind of show that they might be human. They have stone tools and they have bone tools that specialize in leather working. So they actually cut leather and stuff to make things. They knew how to control fire, to heat stuff and that sort of thing. They had perfectly balanced and fine-crafted wooden hunting javelins. They made jewelry. This group of what they call Neanderthals made jewelry. They made body decorations and they wore cosmetics. They had cooking utensils and herbs that they put in their food. They buried their dead, and they even did it with ornaments. They had musical instruments that used a pentatonic scale. Kind of sophisticated for a monkey. They had symbolic thinking, they had high-tech super glue for the time, and they had constructed a 1 mile deep under the ground passageway, and it was obvious that they knew how to take the fire down underneath where there was zero light and knew how to light it. These are Neanderthals. Today, I had a hyoid bone, which is kind of like the voice box, so they figured they could speak. Many evolutionists and paleontologists today now say, although being robust in their anatomy, they are fully human. Okay? Well, I want to show you something.
So Neanderthals are just accepted as being human?
No,
Oh.
they're not.
I was
By some,
okay.
by a lot of people they are, but not by a diehard.
All right.
Okay? Not by a diehard. And I'll show you the difference. Or I'll show you an example. Remember this book I brought in? Okay? The book I get, I got this stuff way before the book, but a book that condenses all this that you might be interested in is called Icons of Evolution. The guy actually has 2 books, Icons of Evolution and then more Icons of Evolution. But the first one's actually, I think, the better one. The guy's name is Jonathan Wells. You can pick it up on Amazon. And he goes through this book and shows things that have been iconically used by evolutionists for over 100 years and why they're not true, why they know they're not true, and then shows where they, at least at the time he wrote the book, shows where they are still in science books. And he found this out as he went through his program in science. At the PhD level, he realized they really didn't teach him evolution, so he started doing research, and that's what he found out. That's what the book's about. One of the books that it mentions in there, that science books that still had it, some of that stuff in there, is this one. I got online and found like a $5 copy of it that's already, just so I could bring it in and show people. And on page 360, should be these pages right here. There's Neanderthal. It's still there. You can't let go of all of your icons if you don't have that many more. Because if you don't, the whole theory collapses. Some of them they've been forced to release. Some of them they still say, well, I think it is, so I'm putting it in the book so I can convince people that evolution is true. I mean, I'm being simplistic, but that's kind of what's going on. All right? All right. Even to the point, you know who this guy is? He's on a lot of commercials. This is Geico. Okay? They're still using it as a caveman, which is cute, but at the same time, it's still a little bit disingenuous. All right? All right. The next one, I'm not going to show the video on that either. So we got Nebraska man on the way. We got Neanderthals. Next one we're going to talk about is one called Ramapithecus. Ramapithecus was found in India in 1932. And until 1980, it was thought to be a direct ancestor of humans. Originally, they only found fragments of a jaw and several teeth. And this is the part. They didn't find the upper part. They found this half of the jaw, this half of the skull over here, this little bit, and then that over there. From that, they constructed the whole skull. And as you can see by the shape and some of that stuff, that it's not a human. But because of some of the characteristics, they claimed that it was something halfway in between. All right? Until somebody did a little more research on the fossil, and they found out that it was actually from an orangutan. Okay? I don't know if you guys remember this movie with Clint Eastwood, every which way but loose. But that was Clint Eastwood and what they called Manus, which was his sidekick in this movie, who was an orangutan. Here's what's interesting that I find about that. They discovered that this was an orangutan in 1980, but the movie came out in 1978. So I can't say that they were actually trying to show you that we can be buddies because we're related, but there's an implication there, I think. But they didn't find out until 2 years after the movie came out. Kind of like they didn't find until, what was it, a few years after the monkey trial that the tooth was. So there's a lot of this kind of stuff going on, but we don't follow the timelines. All right? We don't do that. Why? Because we got other things to do. Right? So they can feed us any information they want if we don't look it up. Kind of the way it is. All right. There's another one. Go on. Ramapithecus. The next one is one called Java Man. A guy named Dubois found an ape-like skull fragment, and then 50 feet away he found a human leg bone. The discovery was called Java Man, and it claimed he claimed in later years that the fossil was more closely related to a gibbon. Of course, again, this is after the damage is done. This caused a significant controversy when they came out and said it was a gibbon. It caused a real controversy in the scientific community. The new view of this set of fossils that he had discovered is based on his reevaluation of the features of the fossils themselves. So, there's another one that was gone. The next one, well, I do want you to see this. This is kind of important. I've got this someplace else, but I'll talk about it real briefly here. This is the way that you know how we saw the chart where one goes to another, goes to another, goes to another. Their present way of speaking of this isn't a continuum. It is, here are what they call the anthropods, okay? And then offshoots from that are all these other ones, including the human. So it's a different way of looking at it that supposedly helps them explain better as to why some of these mishaps are going on.
Just like looking at this image, the human just doesn't fit in
No
that
kidding.
category.
Yeah, no kidding. That's what I think.
Like in the transition you showed, once it starts to look like a monkey, it's just a straight drop off from being human.
Yeah.
I find it ridiculous.
But for me, I always ask myself, if that's possible, that we can change from one to another, I've got to find something else. That's why at the beginning, and I think you walked in a little bit late, to me, the more important argument is, was there a mind first or was there matter first? Okay, did we start out as a mindless piece of rock or gas or whatever, and then mind was developed through an evolutionary process? Do we get to the point where we can feel and think and be logical nowadays? Okay, that would also imply that from that same rock or gaseous substance or slime or whatever it was that has no mind came the mutations to get us from here to here. Or the alternative is, does a mind come first? Which is important in the arguments such as the small machines that we find inside the cell that are so intricate, they have to all be there at the same time, and they have to have coded information coming from the DNA in order for them to replicate and even work. Coded information can't come from a rock, it can come only from a mind. Okay? Since this one has a mind that can do logical things like human beings can more than an animal, that's another way I see this as being not a smooth transition. It is, these guys are all instinctive, boom, now we got something different. But they're not making that distinction. Make sense? It goes along with your argument. I'm not trying to argue with you, I'm trying to develop it just a little bit more. Okay? All right, last one today that I would like to mention. And this one came out in my lifetime. It was in the 1970s. I was out of high school. All right? It was a big splash in the papers. They got me now. All right? It was Lucy. Anybody heard of Lucy? If you've been in science classes, you probably should have. Have you? Yeah. Okay. Like I said, 1970s. This was discovered by a guy named Johansen in 1974. It was a 3.5-foot skeleton. It looked like a chimpanzee, but he claimed it had some other characteristics, like the legs and the hips meant that Lucy could walk upright. Well, that to him meant that it's in between. It's a type of fossil. But on the other hand, there are some chimps that can walk upright. So who's to say, from my point of view, if that was a chimp or if that was an in-between? Another thing that I had read, and I tried to find this again to confirm it, but I read this a long time ago. I'm finding now, as I do more research nowadays, some of the stuff that I used to be able to find looks like it's been wiped off the internet. Or at least it's put so far down to the bottom that you can't get to it, because you'd have to go through hundreds and hundreds of pages to even find it. Because I know I've read some of this stuff before, but I didn't at that time write down where I got it from, so it's hard to go back and find it. But I remember them saying that the knee joint that and some of the other bones that were found that would make this guy or this girl, I think it's a girl, be able to stand up and walk right, that they were found a long ways away from each other. long ways away, and even at different depth levels. And then they kind of put them together. But they found a lot more Lucy fossils since, so I don't know exactly whether or not that would still hold or not. But there's a British zoologist named Zuckerman who said this: there are distinguished evolutionists who admit that these extinct primates, talking about Lucy, were not anatomically intermediate between apes and humans. They were just apes. They still use this one. It's in this book. Lucy's still in the books, all right? And it's one of their big ones now. It's still used quite a little bit. One of the other things that they had on Lucy was the fact that there were footprints, okay? There are distinct, oh, that's Zuckerman there. Okay, the main evolutionary storyline favoring Lucy as a human ancestor involved some famous footprints. Independent studies determined that the African tracks exactly match those of humans. So in other words, as they did more and more research, they found out that these weren't in-between footprints, these were human footprints. So how do you put, they dated the rocks to back at the time when they thought Lucy was, but humans weren't supposed to be there, but now they know that the footprints that are in that strata are human. This is a problem. Can you see how that's a problem? Okay? But you don't hear about that. And like I said, we could watch this film, but we don't have time. This is a comic I found. I don't know, see if you get it. Rocking the anthropological world, a second Lucy has been discovered in Uganda. You know who that is, right? Peanuts was my favorite growing up. I watched them on, or read them in the newspaper every single week. So look here. Pretty much, if you look at it from a little bit different glasses, some of them are outright lies, and the other ones are very questionable. Okay, some of them they've dropped, some of them they have not dropped yet. 2 quotes, and we're done. I fully agree. This is Patterson, a paleontologist. I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions, in other words, in between fossils, in my book. If I knew of any fossils or any fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. This guy wrote a book on transitional forms, and he didn't include any because he didn't know of any that he could count on. You suggest that the artist should be used to visualize such transformations, which they have done. And then this guy that he's writing to actually would have said to him, why didn't you just use, pictures that were drawn instead? But where would I get the information from? I could not honestly provide it. And if I were to leave it to the artistic license, would that not mislead the reader? They've done a lot of that. Here's one more quote, and it's from Charles Darwin himself. But just in proportion of the process of extermination has acted on the on an enormous scale, so must the number of intermediate varieties. In other words, he's talking about the number of fossils that they found at his time, all right, which have formerly existed on Earth, being truly enormous. He says there's a lot of regular fossils, but not the others. Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? We've got a lot of regular fossils. Why aren't they full of these intermediates? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. And this, perhaps, is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory. If you can't find a lot of transitional forms, my theory is not going to work. Darwin knew that way back when he wrote the book. So they're scrambling for them. All right. Any questions? I thank you for your patience. Yeah.
This isn't a question, but just something to say. I saw this study a while back. They used the same process they used for like when they find a fossil and constructing an image from that fossil. They took that same process and applied it to modern day skeletons, and the animals just look nothing like what they are.
It's rigged, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot of rigging going on. Are there not people that honestly believe this? And yeah, there are. But are there people that know that they have to, since they have this viewpoint, that they got to make sure that they prove this viewpoint, so they take the evidence and present it in such a way that shows that they're right? Until they convince enough people where you're not scientific if you don't believe it. That's really what's happening. I remember the first time I actually came to that conclusion. I still remember that. And I was probably at least in my 30s.
I also think a lot of people look at it and go like, evolution is surprisingly more complicated, so it must be the correct answer.
Yeah. Yeah, scientists are a lot more smart than I am, so they must know stuff that I don't know. That's why some of these simpler arguments that I tried to cover at the beginning, I think are so powerful, because most people, I still remember, I had been working on this in my mind for such a long time. And I'm driving down the road one day, and I come to the realization that if evolution is true, I came from a rock. And I thought, how many people know this? I've taught a lot of these classes over the years. When I mention that, I see faces drop. People don't think about that, because they concentrate you on the monkeys, because they kind of look like you. It's like holding the real answer behind your back, all right? And people never see it. They only see what they want to, what they present, what they want you to see. Which means if this is true, and I'm not trying to force anybody into believing this, but if what I'm saying in all of these, and I got lots more for you coming up, guys, if this is really true, it's the biggest hoax that's ever been perpetuated on the face of the earth.
And it likely means that they are actively trying to suppress the truth.
Which is exactly what Romans says.
Yep.
Romans chapter 1. You know the scripture?
I don't know it like word for word, but I know I've heard
Starts
it
in-
from my friend.
Read it. It starts in verse 18, isn't it? I think it's verse 18 it starts. Read it sometime. It's a passage of about, I don't know, 10 verses or so.